When we look at the world today, we see that almost without exception, every country is in debt. The debt of the United States has surpassed $38 trillion, the highest level in its history. The European Union carries a total debt burden of approximately $14 trillion. Japan's debt is approaching $9 trillion, a figure equivalent to several times the country's annual economic output. And the issue is not limited to economically struggling countries. Even states known for oil revenues, like Saudi Arabia, and export giants such as Germany and China, are heavily indebted. In other words, debt is no longer the language of the weak. It has become the common language of the system itself. This naturally raises a fundamental question. If everyone is in debt, who exactly owns this debt? Doesn't someone, somewhere, have to be the creditor? At first glance, the answer seems simple. We say that states owe money to each other, to banks, to investors, and to international institutions. But this explanation only reveals a small part of the picture. Because once you begin tracing the debt, you never arrive at a clear, final creditor. The chain stretches on, the links tangle into one another, and eventually the system begins to look as if it is borrowing from itself. It is at this point that debt ceases to be merely an economic statistic. Money, power, and history intertwine. Debt becomes an invisible architecture that determines how wars are financed, how crises are managed, and how empires are sustained. In the modern world, debt is not simply a burden. It is the order itself. State budgets, central banks, pension funds, and global markets are all built upon this architecture. Moreover, this system operates in a way that defies common sense. An increase in a country's debt does not always mean it is weakening. On the contrary, the ability to borrow is often interpreted as a sign of trust in that country. Today, the countries with the highest debt levels are also the ones that can borrow at the lowest interest rates. This alone shows that debt plays a far more complex role than we tend to assume. For this reason, this story is not just about numbers. It is a financial history of how modern finance works, why it continuously produces debt, and why these debts were never truly designed to be paid off. To understand how we arrived at a point where the planet is burdened with more than $315 trillion, in debt nearly 3 times the size of the global economy, we may need to return to the very beginning. Before credit cards existed, before digital money could even be imagined, what we now call national debt took shape not in financial centers, but inside states pushed to the brink by war. In 1694, England was locked in a grueling war with France, and the treasury's gold reserves were nearly exhausted. The king turned to merchants for help. In exchange, he promised them regular interest payments secured by future tax revenues. To formalize this relationship, the Bank of England was established. This was not an ordinary financial maneuver. It was a shift in mindset. The state could now spend money it did not have, offering in return an official, tradable promise to its lenders. This is how the government bond was born. France adopted the model. The Netherlands refined it further. The newly formed United Kingdom turned it into an engine of growth. States used it to finance their revolutions and later their westward expansions. National debt ceased to be a sign of failure and became a measure of credibility. The ability to borrow became the ability to govern. Empires once conquered land to extract gold. Now they issue bonds to extract interest. The battlefield became the balance sheet. 3 centuries later, debt has become the world's most dominant export. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes more than $9 trillion. And global debt is growing at a pace equivalent to $1 trillion every 100 days. Every country is in debt. Every bank lends. Every citizen, through taxes, savings, and pensions, is both debtor and creditor at the same time. So who exactly is holding the other end of the rope? Let us begin with the United States. Because its debt is not merely national, it is global. Roughly half of this $38 trillion is held by the public, meaning it is owed not to other branches of government, but to investors. About 2/3 of those investors are American institutions, banks, pension funds, investment funds, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve itself. The remaining 1/3, approximately $9 trillion, is held by foreign entities. Japan holds the largest share at around $1 trillion, followed by China at roughly $800 billion. Then come the United Kingdom, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So when people say the US is indebted to China, that is true, but only for about 2% of the total debt. Most of America's debt is owed to America itself. The Treasury issues bonds. Banks and funds buy them. The Federal Reserve often buys them back, creating new dollars in the process. Americans pay taxes that finance the interest on these bonds, and that interest then flows back into American retirement accounts. It is a circular mirror. The debt is real, but the creditor is largely a reflection of the same system. End. This circularity is not uniquely American, it is global. Japan lends, the US lends to Europe through treasury bonds. The US lends to Europe through the IMF. Europe lends to developing countries through the World Bank. Developing countries, in turn, use their foreign exchange reserves and Western bonds to lend back to advanced economies. This is a planet-wide game of hot potato. Except the potato is made of promises. Every country holds someone else's debt. Every promise is secured by another promise. It is like a poker table, where every player is borrowing chips from the next. And the only rule that keeps the game alive is that no one stands up. But there is a fourth layer more, powerful than all the rest, the markets themselves. Behind every government bond stands a web of institutions. Hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks managing trillions of dollars in assets. These are the true referees of credit. They decide which countries can borrow cheaply, and which must pay a premium just to survive. When they lose confidence, currencies collapse, governments fall, and entire economies can be restructured overnight. Democracy decides who governs. Markets decide who survives. And the ultimate market maker, the modern high priest of this system, is the central bank. Central banks do not merely manage debt, they produce it. When the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank buys a government bond, it creates new money in exchange. A liability on one balance sheet becomes an asset on another. Every dollar in circulation represents a unit of debt somewhere else. There is no such thing as debt-free money. Every coin, every banknote, every digital dollar has a promissory note invisibly engraved on its surface. For decades, this cycle has sustained itself through trust. As long as investors believe governments will pay interest and, perhaps never repay, the principle, the machine keeps running. But we have seen what happens when trust breaks. In 2010, Greece's government debt became unpaid. Bondholders panicked. Interest rates soared. The European Central Bank and the IMF intervened. But the bailouts came with austerity, tax hikes, spending cuts, and mass unemployment. For an entire generation, rescue became synonymous with sacrifice. In Argentina, repeated defaults turned debt into a national curse. In Sri Lanka, when the government ran out of foreign currency to service its loans, fuel shortages and political collapse followed. When the system breaks, creditors suddenly become visible. The IMF rating agencies, anonymous bondholders, gripping entire nations by the throat. And yet, even after collapse, the same logic resumes. New loans replace old ones. Old debts are restructured. The machine resets itself under a new name on the same balance sheet. Because in the 21st century, Debt is not designed to be repaid. It is designed to be rolled over. Today, governments are not actually planning to pay off their debts. Not now, not ever. This is not a conspiracy. It is policy. When you or I take out a loan, we are expected to repay the principal. Governments operate differently. They treat debt as a perpetual subscription, issuing new bonds to pay off old ones. A process economists call refinancing. Interest becomes the real product. Rent paid for stability. The global economy now depends on this rent, like a shark that must keep swimming to breathe. The global financial system today is not built on repayment, but on belief. The United States will never pay off its $38 trillion of debt. It will refinance it forever. Japan has been rolling over its debt for decades, and it now exceeds 250% of GDP. Yet government bond yields remain near zero. Investors do not expect their money back. They expect the contract to be renewed. Why? Because for them, sovereign debt is the safest collateral that exists. U.S. Treasury bonds are not seen as liabilities. They are assets, the foundation of global markets. Pension funds hold them. Banks use them as collateral. Central banks treat them as money. The system depends on governments never paying off their debt, because if they did, the world would lose its most trusted financial instrument. Imagine Washington deciding to repay every dollar it owes. Banks and funds around the world would suddenly lose their most stable asset. The supply of dollars would shrink dramatically, triggering deflation and collapse. Paying off the debt would destroy the very thing that keeps the economy functioning. That is why governments do the opposite. They continue issuing more debt, not recklessly, but rhythmically. Debt has become a kind of heartbeat for capitalism itself, pulsing through every pension fund, mortgage, and market on the planet. This is why politicians who talk about balancing budgets or reducing national debt are selling an illusion. The goal is not to eliminate debt. The goal is to make it sustainable, serviceable, and desirable enough that the system never loses faith in it. Because when faith erodes, numbers stop mattering, trust collapses, interest rates rise, and an economy built entirely on rolling promises grinds to a halt. That is the true secret of sovereign debt. The plan was never to repay it. The plan was to make the world believe it would be repaid. This is a closed loop of trust. And as long as that trust holds, the numbers can stretch indefinitely. But trust is not distributed equally. When we say we owe the debt to ourselves, that is only partly true. Interest payments do not flow evenly through society. They move upward from taxpayers and workers to institutions and investors who hold the debt. In other words, debt is not just a transfer between countries. It is a transfer between classes. This is why global inequality and global indebtedness rise together. The system rewards those who own debt and punishes those who only pay it. If this sounds familiar, it is because it is the same story told at a larger scale, from households to nations, from nations to the planet. Creditors are not villains. Debtors are not victims. They are two sides of the same engine. The real question is what happens when the engine runs out of fuel, when new borrowing can no longer keep pace with old promises. That is when the question, who is the creditor, stops being abstract and becomes personal. Because at the top of this global pyramid, there is no single villain to blame. Not China, not Wall Street, not the IMF. It is all of them, and all of us. Modern finance has turned debt itself into money. Governments issue it. Banks multiply it. Investors trade it. Citizens become dependent on it. The line between debtor and creditor has blurred beyond recognition. Debt was once associated with chains. Today, it is associated with stability. But when the balance breaks, when trust dissolves, we see debt for what it truly is, a promise that cannot be held forever. If this narrative opened a different window for you, subscribe. History hides the answers. Together, we will learn how to read them.